Welcome to the Wildscast. Today I had the honor of interviewing one of the most inspirational people I've ever met, Jacqueline Murekatete, who is a genocide survivor of the Rwandan Genocide campaign. And she tells her story on the Wildscast. And also I asked her about what she thought about what's happening today in Ukraine. Take a listen. Welcome to the Wildscast, everyone. I am so excited to be able to welcome and introduce someone I have a great of respect for, Jacqueline Murekatete. Hope I said that correctly. Jacqueline is a internationally recognized genocide survivor and a human rights activist. She was born in Rwanda, and Jacqueline was 9 when she lost her parents, all of her 6 siblings, and most of her extended family to the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. Jacqueline was actually inspired to share her story of survival and hope for first time back in 2001 after she listened to the story of the late Holocaust survivor David Gewurtzman. Did I say that right, Jacqueline? David Gewurtzman,
Yes.
who became a dear friend and mentor to Jacqueline. And since then, Jacqueline has delivered hundreds of genocide prevention and human rights presentation at schools. The way Jacqueline and I actually met for the first time was on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We sat on the same panel. It was sponsored by the New York State Bar, and I was just blown away and just so impressed with her incredible story and the activism that she is doing. She has spoken here throughout the United States, Germany, Israel, Ireland, Bosnia, Belgium. She's addressed the United Nations General Assembly, and her story and her work has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, Huffington Post, Jerusalem Post, CNN, NBC, ABC, MTV. I mean, she's all over. She's an incredible personality and has also received a number of prestigious awards and is the founder and president of Genocide Survivors Foundation, which is a New York-based non-for-profit which educates people about the crime of genocide. And it is such an honor to have you with us, Jacqueline. I just want to mention something else. That Jacqueline has her BA in politics from NYU, from New York University, and got her JD from my alma mater, Benjamin Cardozo School of Law. So I don't think we overlapped. I think we weren't there at the same time, but we went to the same school. So that's another connection.
Yes. 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 Well, thank
Um,
you so much. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
it is really such a pleasure and honor. Tell us, for those who might not know, our listeners, and we're going to get into what's going on in the Ukraine in just a little while because I want to hear your take and your perspective, given your own personal story and what you've been doing. But for those who might not know, what was the Rwanda genocide? How long did it last, and how did you survive?
Yeah. The genocide. So the genocide took place in starting in April of 1994, specifically on the night of April 6, 1994, and it lasted for approximately 100 days. And in those 100 days, it's estimated that over a million people. Most people say 800,000, but the Rwandan government has actually estimated that over a million people were murdered, systematically murdered in those 100 days. So the killings were very, very efficient for many reasons. One, because like any other genocide, this was very much planned. There was a dehumanization campaign which preceded the genocide, where Tutsis, my ethnic group, were portrayed in the newspapers, on the national radio as the enemy, as invaders, as cockroaches, which needed to be exterminated. The genocide was also preceded by years, decades of systematic discrimination of Tutsis being the minority ethnic group in Rwanda. So when I was born in Rwanda and when I was growing up as a child in Rwanda, I was aware that I lived in a country where my ethnic group, members of my ethnic group, were treated as second-class citizens. The Hutu extremist government at that time, for example, had ethnic quotas in schools where they only allowed very few Tutsis to go to high school and to go to college. And prior to the genocide, the country, Rwanda, had also witnessed a number of genocidal killings, like massacres, as early as starting in 1959 throughout 60s and 70s. So the genocide against the Tutsi in 1994 was really a result of these years of systematic discrimination, of dehumanization, of killings of Tutsis, always with impunity. Um, my story of survival, I mean, it's a long one. I'll probably take more time than we have to actually go
And,
through it.
and but before you get into your story, Jacqueline, and I do want to hear it. I think it's important for us to hear just briefly as best as you can. But was there any reason given by the Hutus for this attempt at systematically exterminating, eradicating the Tutsis? Was there, or is just like any form of bigotry and racism, like what the Nazis did to the Jews? Is it just like made up stuff and there's just pure hatred?
Yeah. So, the ideology of genocide or the anti-Tutsi propaganda really began with colonialism. So when Germans were actually the first Europeans to reach Rwanda, followed by Belgians. So after World War One, Rwanda became a protectorate of, Belgium became a protectorate of Rwanda. And when the Belgians were ruling over Rwanda, they at that time, when they came to Rwanda, when the Europeans came to Rwanda, Rwanda was a monarchy ruled by a Tutsi king. And initially, the Germans and later the Belgians favored the Tutsis because they were in power. They were the ruling, the king was a Tutsi. And after World War One, when many African countries were began asking for independence, Belgium was not very happy that the Tutsi king was asking for independence. So the Belgians switched their favor and their support for the Hutu majority. And the Belgians began this narrative of Tutsis being foreigners. So they thought that Tutsis were not really true Rwandans, that they were people who had come from Ethiopia and invaded Rwanda and took over the country from the Hutus. And this is a kind of narrative that was
Mhm.
introduced during colonialism by the Belgians, but was
Mhm.
later continued by the Hutu extremists who took power after Rwanda became independent in 1961. So when I was born in a country where Hutu children, my Hutu neighbors, the kids that I went to school with, were taught that myself and members of my family, members of my ethnic group, that we were not true Rwandans, that we were foreigners who had come to Rwanda, who had and whose only goal was to oppress the Hutus. That's a kind of narrative and anti-Tutsi propaganda and hatred that was part of the formally that was part of the educational system in Rwanda. I mean, today you hear from survivors who will tell you how many times they were asked to stand up in a classroom prior to the genocide, and where the students would be separated, between Hutus and Tutsis. And the Hutu children and Tutsi children will listen at this anti-Tutsi narrative was retold by teachers as part of the formal this formal educational system. So
Did
the
you
hatred
experience
and
that?
the
Did you experience that as a child?
Yes, growing up, I was very much aware that I lived in a country where I did not have the same opportunities, the same
Mhm.
privileges as my Hutu classmates. On one hand, we lived in villages that were not segregated. So the village where I grew up, it wasn't just like a Tutsi village. And that was the case throughout Rwanda. Hutus and Tutsis lived in the same villages, sharing things, like sharing goods and services, going to the same churches, going to the same child naming ceremonies, going to the same weddings. But underneath all that, there was always this narrative and this propaganda that was always propagated by the ruling Hutu extremist government, which
Mhm.
always had interest in monopolizing power by propagating this
Uh,
anti-Tutsi narrative and propaganda.
and how did you survive this? I mean, your whole family was wiped out.
Yeah, yeah. So, when the genocide began in April of 1984, I happened to be in my grandmother's village, my maternal grandmother's village. So that was partly how I ended up surviving, because from the very beginning of the genocide, I was separated from my family. The beginning of the genocide actually coincided with the Easter break or spring break here.
Mhm.
And growing up, I attended school in my grandmother's village. So I had left my family village. I had gone to my grandmother's village thinking that I was going to go back to school because the Easter break had just ended. And when the genocide began, as I mentioned, this is something that was again prepared in advance, many years in advance. There are many journalists now who have detailed the type of planning that took place before the actual killings happened, including the importation of machetes and other weapons, the drafting of lists of prominent Tutsis who will be the first targets of the genocide. There was an extensive training of Hutu youth to carry out the killings. And when the
Oh,
killings actually started, one of the first things that the government asked was the roadblocks be placed throughout Rwanda. And what this created was an environment where a Tutsi could no longer, even those who had the means to flee outside Rwanda in search of refuge, could no longer do so. Because the other thing that I failed to mention is that growing up in Rwanda, we had an ethnic based ID cards. So when you're born in Rwanda, you were labeled as a Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa. And when you became of age, you had an ID. And you carried this ID whenever you went to apply for schools, whenever you went to apply for a job. This was a formal way that the Hutu regime managed to discriminate against Tutsis in really in every aspect of the Rwandan society. So when the genocide started, the roadblocks were placed everywhere, and the Hutu extremists who had planned the genocide said anybody who passed a roadblock and was identified as a Tutsi, either by your physical feature, because there's some physical differences, or by your ID card, uh, if you identified as Tutsi, you were taken aside. If you're lucky, you were shot. But in most cases, you were macheted, you were beaten to death, you were tortured in the most horrific way. So this became the environment in Rwanda in April of 1994 and for the next 100 days of the genocide. So as a result, I could no longer go back to my parents' village. My father and my brother, who used to come and get me from my grandmother's village, could no longer come. And when the killings began in my grandmother's village, we fled. Myself, my grandmother, another cousin who was with us, as well as other Tutsis in a village. And we initially fled to a local, what would be an equivalent of a mayor's office or district office here in the U.S. And we went there because we thought that we would be protected. I think at the beginning of the genocide, there was this denial. People didn't really believe that, our neighbors, who, as I said, we had many, shared many things with, had gone to the same churches, had gone to the same weddings, that these people would murder us for no other reason other than our ethnicity. So we fled to the district office, and when we got there, we met thousands of other Tutsis who came there. In the end, we actually had thousands, more than 30,000. I think they say people fled there. But it was only within a few days that our Hutu neighbors, the same people who I mentioned, whose children I grew up, playing with, going to school with, these Hutu neighbors started following us, initially at night and then later on during the day, and they began killing. They always came
mm,
singing that Tutsis were cockroaches, that Tutsis deserve to be exterminated. This is a kind of message and incitement to kill they were listening to every day from the national radio. The Hutu extremists will come to the radio and they will say, Tutsis are enemies, Tutsis are deserve to die. We must kill all Tutsis, young, old, male, female. The goal in 1994 was extermination of Tutsis and any Hutu who was opposed to the extermination plan. While at the county office, I witnessed many killings of many of my relatives from my mom's side. Had fled there, and I witnessed many killings. And I always said that it's a miracle that that I survived. Long story short, an uncle of mine found out that we were there and that killings were taking place every day, and that it was really a matter of time before we would be killed. And he miraculously managed to find a Hutu man who he paid and who managed to get us away from the county office or district office before we were killed. After that, and I'm skipping a lot of details again because of the time. After that, my
Sure.
grandmother, myself, and my cousin, we found ourselves hiding in a Hutu family's home, a Hutu family that agreed to hide us, and we stayed for about a week until our hiding place was discovered. To this day, we don't know exactly how the Hutus who are going around every day and night killing, how they found out that we're there. But I remember one morning our hiding place was attacked, and my grandmother, myself, and my cousin, um, we were being pushed around, and we had these. I remember vividly having these Hutu men who were armed with bloody machetes. So I knew that they had spent the whole night killing. And they were telling the Hutu men who was hiding us that they were going to kill us because we were cockroaches. All Tutsis were cockroaches, and all Tutsis deserve to die. That message was clear to Hutu civilians during the genocide. And
And at this
I
point, Jacqueline, at this point, I mean, had you any contact with your parents? Did you know what was happening with them? I mean, you were 9, separated from your parents.
I had no idea about what's going on in my parents' village. I did not know whether they were dead or alive. There was no way that I could go there because, again, there were roadblocks all over the place. But I think because I was young and I was naive, I always tell people that throughout the genocide, throughout those 100 days of killings, I really never lost hope that my family was alive. I used to tell myself that certainly, there's a neighbor, one of my good neighbors, one of the neighbors where I used to go play, with my friends. Like I used to believe that somebody will hide them, and that when the killings ended, I would go back to my parents' village and I'll find them and I'll find my 6 siblings, and somehow life will go back to some type of normal. So that's a hope that I had throughout the genocide. But there was no way because Rwanda wasn't the type of country where people could, I mean, at that time, even the few people who had telephones, I mean, everything was cut off by the government. The government really wanted to make sure that, people did not know what was going on. And again, those who had the means to flee were not able to do that. So after we were discovered and nearly faced death one more time, we were lucky again to survive. I always say that people ask me, how did you survive that? And I always say, some people will say it's luck, other people will say it's God. But whenever I look back at that moment, for me, I really do believe that, it was God who saved me, because it wasn't because I was a child. It wasn't because, my grandmother was old lady. I mean, this is the kind of things that the family that was hiding us kept saying, but the Hutu men who had come to kill us kept saying it didn't matter. All Tutsis are cockroaches, all Tutsis deserve to die. But for one reason or another, those men who had come to kill us, they left us. But they also told the Hutu man who was hiding us that he could no longer hide us, that he had to get rid of us. And it was at that time
How did he
that
know? How did he know he was hiding? That he was hiding you? How did the
had
Houthis who came?
So to this day, I don't know how they found out. It could have been a neighbor who maybe
Right.
saw us or heard us and went and informed them, because there was a lot of people. Whenever I talk about the genocide, people participate in many ways. There are people who picked up machetes and they killed, and there are people who saw people hiding, in bushes, hiding in different parts of the country, and they would not go and kill them, but they report about the hiding places. There are people certainly who turned away.
Yeah.
Most people turned.
Unfortunately, this is all too familiar because if you study Anne Frank, the
Mhm.
famous Anne Frank, who was hidden for so many years with her family in Amsterdam, and
Yeah,
ultimately they were given up by others
yeah,
to the
hmm
Nazis.
yeah,
But there was a righteous family that hid them. And have
yeah.
you had any contact with the incredible people that hid you? Have you stayed in touch with them?
Not since the genocide, not since the
Mhm.
genocide. And it's actually that story gets a little bit more complicated too, because in Rwanda you had people who hid people, they hid certain people, but they killed others.
Oh,
So
I
after
understand.
yeah, so they may hide somebody because they knew them personally, or because in this case my uncle had paid that family to hide us. But they also at the same time they were going to the roadblocks and killing others.
Oh,
So after
I
the
understand.
genocide, I did find out that the Hutu men who had hid us had been accused by others, other Tutsi survivors in the village, of having participated in killing other Tutsis as well. So I am grateful that he hid me and my grandmother. By the way, my grandmother did not survive because after we were discovered in that man's home, he informed my grandmother of an orphanage that was nearby and that was managed by two Italian priests. This was an orphanage that had existed in Rwanda prior to the genocide, where these two Italian priests had come to Rwanda, set up this orphanage where they used to care for children, Hutu children, Tutsi children whose parents had died of malaria and other diseases. And when the genocide happened, these two Italian priests were among the few foreigners who, at the risk of their own lives, decided to stay in Rwanda and try to save as many children as they could. And I
Wow.
said few because once the killing started, many of the foreigners who had lived in Rwanda as journalists, businessmen, diplomats, they picked up and they left. They left once they realized that a genocide was going on. Embassies, the U.S. embassy, the Belgium embassy, they came and they evacuated their people. But these two Italian priests refused. The Italian embassy tried to take them back to Italy, but they said they were going to try to stay and try to protect children. And they stayed and they had that orphanage. So it is in that orphanage where my cousin and I ended up surviving. Even there, we many times we came face to face with men who entered the orphanage and threatened to kill us and the other Tutsi children who were there. So there were many instances, even in the orphanage, where we came face to face with death, and we survived. But my grandmother was not allowed in the orphanage because the Italian priests were only taking in children. They didn't want to
Children,
try
yeah.
to take in, yes, because Hutu militias were coming in the orphanage every day looking for Tutsi adults. They would search up and down in every corner. And whenever they found Tutsi adults, they would take them out and they would kill them. So at some point, the two Italian priests decided that it was a risk to the children to try to hide any Tutsi adults. So my grandmother was not allowed in the orphanage, but she knew that because of the foreign presence of the two Italian priests, that my cousin and I had more chances of surviving in the orphanage. And the day that I left my grandmother for the orphanage ended up being the last time that I saw her, because after the genocide, I would learn that she was killed. I mean, I never saw her again, but to this day, I don't know exactly where she was killed. It's one of the most difficult um, thing for survivors, of I think of the Holocaust and genocide, to not know. We know our families, many of our family members, we know that they were killed, but we don't know where. There's no tombstone for them. There's not a burial place where we can go and say, this is where my father is, this is where my grandmother is. So with my grandmother and many other relatives, I know that she was killed soon after I went to the orphanage, but I never found out, where and by whom. Um, I mean, this is, and many people who were killed, they were thrown in mass graves. I mean, during the genocide, I always say there was an intention not only to exterminate Tutsis, but to also to erase any evidence that the Tutsis ever existed. So they would, throw people in mass graves. My own family was murdered by the river, and their bodies were thrown in that river. So I never had the opportunity to give them a proper burial as well. Um, they were
How did you
like
how did
many
how
other
did you
Tutsis.
process? How did you, as a 9-year old, just I can't even imagine how you processed, how you dealt with this, just emotionally, spiritually. You know, I'm wondering, how what you went through shapes your view of people, of humanity. You said that you believe that God saved you,
Hmm.
and certainly these Italian priests,
Yeah.
and there were also in the Holocaust there were some great people, righteous Gentiles who saved Jews at the risk of their own life.
Hmm.
I've always wondered, like, how does that? Do you look at people differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think the righteous Gentiles and the Hutus, the few Hutus who stood up in 1994 and tried to protect their Tutsi neighbors, the two Italian priests. I think for survivors like myself, it's really what gave us, the courage to go on, to recognize that while, there's so much evil and we had witnessed, the worst of evil, and we had, lost our families, and we had, lost our innocence, that, that there is good in the world as well. I feel for me, that's what has propelled me forward over the past, almost 28 years now, since the genocide. But I always say that, because when we were going through the genocide, especially as a child, it was very difficult to understand how it is that, you know, one day you have your family, you have your parents, you have your siblings, you have goals and dreams. Yes, as I said, I was aware that I lived in a country that had many discriminatory measures against my ethnic group, but I had my family and I had my hopes and I had my dreams. And my parents always said that, it told us that if we worked hard enough, perhaps we'll be one of those few Tutsis who'll be allowed to go to high school and college and so forth. And within, a matter of like 3 months, over 100 days, to find yourself in a place where your entire family, your neighbors, it wasn't just my immediate family, as you mentioned, but most of my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, gone and murdered by our neighbors, not by strangers, but by people who used to come and, borrow salt from my mother in the middle of the night when they realized they didn't have enough salt to cook, by people who used to meet at church and worship together. It was very difficult for me, and other survivors, I think, particularly for those of us who are young, to really uh, confront this type of reality and this type of evil. But I think for me, what has encouraged me, is really meeting people, knowing that there were some people who stood up, and the people that I've had in my life since the genocide, people like David Gertzman, who I hope will talk more about, and people who used to come and help me learn English when I first arrived in this country, the teachers and people who, to this day, despite all the evils, all the terrible things that are going in the world, they are still committed to increasing the righteous Gentiles, increasing the number of people who actually stand up when genocide and other forms of mass atrocities occur. And I think part of my work now, or the motivation behind my work, is to do my part to increase the number of people who actually stand up in times of genocide, in times of mass atrocities, and do the right thing, because there's no doubt that if there were more righteous Gentiles, during the Holocaust, if there were more Hutus, civilians who stood up in Rwanda in 1994, the genocide would not have happened. So it wasn't just the people who were perpetrating the genocide, but the large majority of the bystanders and the informants and the people who just let it happen, people who thought, this is not my problem, it's too risky for me to get involved, or it doesn't concern me. As long as I'm not being personally affected or attacked, that's not my business. And that type of indifference is really something that I've committed my life to fighting, and hopefully
I
doing my
I I,
part.
I see that. Maybe you can tell us a little. You've done something extraordinary, Jacqueline, which is not only survive, but you fought back in a sense by starting this incredible Genocide Survivors Foundation, um, with the goal of genocide prevention efforts. Tell us
Mhm.
a little about the work you're doing, and I also would love to hear about David Gewurtzman, how this Holocaust survivor inspired you to
Mhm.
get involved in this work.
Yeah. So the work that I do with Genocide Survivors Foundation actually stems from my meeting with David and my relationship with David. So when I was a sophomore in high school in Queens, New York, at Martin Van Buren High School in Queens,
By the way, how old were you when you came here?
I was 10. So I came,
You were 10.
I came
You
a
came
year
right
after the
after.
genocide. Yeah, I came a year. I had an uncle, my mom's brother, who lived in the US, who was out of Rwanda when the genocide happened. And after he found out that my family had been killed and that I had survived, he brought me here and he raised me.
He brought you here. Wonderful.
He adopted me. Yeah.
Wow.
So, and you know that the period, the first few years that I was here were actually very difficult, as you can imagine. I was haunted by a lot of nightmares. There are many nights when I went to bed and I would see people chasing me with machetes, and I wake up crying. And there was just a lot of difficulties, obviously, in adapting to a new culture, learning a new language. But I was very lucky in that I had, again, a lot of support system and people who really came forward and tried to help me adjust here in America. But when I was a sophomore in Martin Van Buren High School in Queens, my classmates, my English class, and I, we read the book Night by Elie Wiesel. And after we read Night, my English teacher, Miss Goldstein, who is a dear friend of mine up to this day, she had the wisdom of trying to find a Holocaust survivor who could come to our class and speak to us and share his experience. And she managed to connect with a local Holocaust center in Glen Cove, Long Island, and where David was a docent. And she managed to have David come to our class, and David shared with us his story as a child during the Holocaust, growing up in Poland, in a village called Oshice, Poland, and how his family was, persecuted and murdered. His most of his family members were murdered in Treblinka. He talked about, out of 800,000 people, Jewish people who lived in his town, only 16 survived. And he shared his experience of how he lived under a pigsty. He was hidden, him and his family were hidden by a Polish farmer under a pigsty for 2 years. And he talked about, coming from that hiding place, which he called a grave, into a mass cemetery where, as 6 million Jewish people had been murdered. And David also shared his commitment to preserving the memory of the Holocaust, to fighting anti Semitism, racism, xenophobia, all forms of extremism, in an effort to prevent what he had experienced as a child during the Holocaust from continuing to happen. And long story short, I ended up after David left. My teacher encouraged us to write thank you notes, and in my thank you note, I mentioned to David that I was a survivor of the genocide in Rwanda. Talked a little bit about my experience. I did not know that I would ever hear from him again, but in fact, I did. He And it turns out he read every letter that he got from students, although he spoke to so many students across the country. And when he came
How
across
old were you at the time? Jacqueline, how old
16,
were you at the time?
I was
16.
16. Yeah, this was in 2001.
And how old was he? How old was David?
At
About
that time, I believe David was 75. I believe he was
75.
75
Wow.
or 73. Yes, he was in his mid 70s.
Hmm.
And he he contacted me. First, he contacted the school. He didn't have my direct contact, and my teacher told me that he wanted to invite me and my uncle to his home. We would visit his home, and it was really him who encouraged me to start sharing my story. And the time that I met David was really a time where I also had felt that I really needed to speak out about what had happened in Rwanda. I recognized that there was so little knowledge within my school, my classmates. They had no idea about the genocide in Rwanda. They didn't even know where Rwanda was. They knew that I was an orphan from somewhere in Africa, but they had no idea. And I felt that, as the only surviving member of my family, I had a responsibility to talk about the type of death that they had, died. That them and over a million people had been murdered, not because of what they had done, but simply because of their ethnicity. So David and I teamed up, and between 2001 and 2012, for more than a decade, him and I traveled together all over this country,
Wow.
high
Wow.
schools, colleges, synagogues, churches, community events, where we shared our stories, side by side, to try to help our audiences, young and old, recognize that, that despite the never again, that was uttered after the Holocaust, that the crime of genocide and the ideology of genocide, this ideology that some people, because of how they look like, what they believe, do not deserve to live, that this ideology still exists in the world, and that it's high time that we really start doing more to fight this ideology and to do more when we see and hear people being targeted and persecuted and murdered simply because of who they are. So David and I shared that commitment, and he that's why, as you read in my bio, he really became a dear friend and a mentor. And unfortunately, he passed away in 2012. Um, and that was very difficult for me, as you can imagine. But
I can imagine.
I have remained for his wife Lillian is still alive. He has two children and six grandkids who are still very big part of my life. And but he, despite what he went through, him and I really we share this hope for a better future. That belief that if we can educate people about the dangers of anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, if we can help people realize that we have more in common as human beings, that our differences really shouldn't matter. David had a quote that he used to say during all his presentations, and he used to say that people have to recognize that diversity is not adversity. Diversity is not adversity. The problem is not diversity. The problem is when groups of people, politicians, or whoever want to use physical differences or economic differences, religious differences, as a way to monopolize power and to and to pin one group of people against another. So that's a type of things that
Wow.
we try to fight.
Well, I'm sure that your continued work on behalf of preventing genocide, I'm sure that he would have been very, very proud of you for everything that you're doing, Jacqueline. Tell us a little about your view of what's happening in Russia, in the Ukraine specifically. And I know this is not your area per se, but I'm just wondering because, we're all watching sort of in shock and in horror what's happening,
Hmm.
what Putin has done. And I wanted to ask you, given the fact that he has targeted civilians, he's bombing buses and trains of people trying to flee the country, would you deem his campaign against the Ukrainian people as some form of genocide against the Ukrainians? Or is this different?
Yeah, I've been reading a lot of obviously all of us reading and seeing, and the atrocities are being committed against the civilian population in particular, as you said. And some people have been comparing it, calling it a genocide, saying never again, and so forth. And I have two things to say about that. One, I don't think something has to be a genocide for us to do something about it or to intervene.
Mhm.
This is a part of the problem, because even in Rwanda, when the genocide was happening, it took a very long time for the international community to use the word genocide, because there is a genocide convention which obligates the Security Council, members of the Security Council, to intervene when there is a genocide. So for that reason, they stayed away from the G word. They kept saying it's a civil war, it's whatever it was, but it wasn't genocide, right? So there's a way that word has been politicized to prevent action, which I think is very problematic. So I do think that something doesn't have to be a genocide for people to intervene. What is clear, as you said, what's going on in Ukraine. For me, I think when it first happened, I was in shock, like most people, that in 2022 a country can decide to invade another sovereign country, and to because they want to force a country to do whatever it wants to do or prevent it from doing whatever it does not want to do, like this can be allowed to happen. For me, that's already a problem in this day and age, that a country, just because they have the power, the military power, the economic power, can decide to invade another country in an effort to force it to do one thing or the other. And I think that when that happens, there is a responsibility on the part of the international community to do something and to stop that type of invasion and aggression. Because if that's not checked, I think this is something that's going to continue to happen by other countries. I think we have to come together, and some people have, with the sanctions and with the military support and so forth. But more needs to be done, because clearly, Putin has not stopped the aggression and the killing and so forth. So I would not call it personally. I would not say that what is going on in Ukraine is a genocide, but it is at the very, I don't even say, I would say least, but there is certainly, cases of war crimes and crimes against humanity happening. There are war crimes because there's been, as it's been reported by various news medias. Like, as you said, there's an indiscriminate targeting of civilians. It's not just, soldiers fighting soldiers. Hospitals are being destroyed, places of worships, historical sites are being destroyed, uh, civilians, apartment buildings are being attacked. And all these things, this is what constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. So personally, that's how I would characterize what is going on, honestly, as a genocide. But certainly, there are cases of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And from what I've read, even the International Criminal Tribunal is undertaking opening an investigation in regards to what's going on. And we know
Yeah.
that they are charged with prosecuting, the crimes of aggression, war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. So, but I think that at the end of the day, what all of us really need to realize and be in agreement is that what is going on in Ukraine is something that should not be going on, should not be allowed to go on. And we as individuals, as organizations, as states, need to keep the pressure up and need to do more to stop
And
the
and do you
killings.
think doing more, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is calling upon the West to enforce a no-fly zone over the Ukraine.
Yeah.
Now, the United States is reluctant to do that because that could bring it, America into war against Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And you're talking about a nuclear power who doesn't seem to be have much of a problem flexing, you know, because when we say we have to do more, so obviously we're raising money for relief. It's a huge
Yeah.
humanitarian crisis.
Yeah.
Over two
Mm-hmm.
to 3 million people now. I have friends that have gone to Poland and to
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, to other countries, neighboring countries, to try to help with the relief efforts. Do
Mm-hmm.
you think we should be pushing? And I'm asking you really as a moral. It's really a
Mm-hmm.
moral question because I
Mm-hmm.
consider you, because of what you've been through and the kind
Mm-hmm.
of foundation and work that you do. I
Mm-hmm.
consider you a moral authority, Jacqueline.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
do you think morally we should be doing that? We should be pushing the Biden administration or other Western countries to do this, which could possibly bring,
Yeah.
and it could escalate things, but it would hopefully stop
Mm-hmm.
Putin's targeting of civilians.
Yeah, yeah. No, personally, if it was up to me, I would say do everything that is necessary to stop, the killings and the indiscriminate attacks on civilians and the atrocities that are being committed. If that's imposing a no-fly zone, if that's sending soldiers, for me, because the concern, as you said, is people are saying if we do this, we're gonna start World War III. Are we prepared to enter World War III? And others are saying, well, actually, World War III has actually begun. But the thing is, I feel that if we continue to live in a world where we allow those type of behaviors and aggression and atrocities to be committed, just because we're afraid of the consequences that it may have on our economic or political or security and so forth. I fear that the more leaders who are allowed to do that, the more this type of cycle is going to continue. So I
Yeah.
feel like the world has to come together and say this is not acceptable in 2022, because I think if that does not happen, then it's a matter of time before another powerful country thinks that it can invade another country and try to do this type of same commit same atrocities and violation of rights. So personally, I mean, these are the same type of arguments that went on with Rwanda, right? People said, we don't want to get involved. We have no economic interest. We have no political interest. Um, but we'll go to Iraq because we have economic interest there. So I think that part of my work is really trying to change that type of thinking and consciousness, and to try to bring people to realize that when atrocities or are being committed, when civilians are being attacked, when a leader or a country thinks like can go and do something like what Russia is doing to Ukraine, that we have to be a chorus and say in action and say this is not okay, and we have to do everything in our power. If that involves even sending our military and soldiers, that's what has to be done, because I do feel like we
Yeah.
really have to move towards a world where we cannot let these things happen just because they are in some place that we feel like does not um, does not directly
Affect us.
affect
Yeah.
us. That's really the problem. I think people who have said like preventing mass atrocities is in all our national interest. It's
Of
all in
course. And
humanity's
by the way,
interest.
Jacqueline, just sort of a proof to what you're saying is in 2008, I believe,
Hmm.
when Putin's already gone into Georgia and he got into the Crimea, and there were no sanctions,
Yeah.
and there were no the international community did not push back forcefully,
Hmm.
and a lot of people are saying that had this is spilled milk. It's it's easy to say what
Yeah.
from this perspective, but
Hmm.
had the world community or the Western world really pushed back hard
Hmm.
on Putin then, he might have thought twice before doing what he's doing now, because he would expect there to be some very serious opposition, not just from the Ukrainians. So
Yes.
I very much agree. And I think that from a moral perspective, we need to be doing more.
Hmm.
Um, I really want to thank you for your bravery, for not simply surviving, but for dedicating your life to bringing this to the world stage. Because it's only survivors of the Holocaust or atrocities that you yourself witnessed and survived. It's only going to be people like yourself that feel this in the most intense kind of way that are going to be able to inspire the rest of us that genocide is still a problem in the world,
Yeah.
and we need to address it in a very, very serious manner.
Yeah.
Um, I want to leave you with a little blessing, if it's okay,
Please
because
do. I always need all the
my
blessings I can get. Thank you.
well, I'll just share my one of the great teachers of the 20th century, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik.
Hmm.
When he was dealing with the question of why bad things happen to good people,
Hmm. Yeah.
he said that we mortals don't really have a way of answering that question entirely.
Yeah.
We don't really know. In order to really answer that, we'd have to be God ourselves.
Mm.
But the one thing we can do, he said, is not in, and I'll give you a little Hebrew. He said the one thing we shouldn't ask is lama, which means why,
Hmm.
because we may not be able to get an answer why bad things happen to good people.
Hmm.
But he twisted it around. He said we can ask not lama, why, but lema, for what?
Mm.
For what
Mm.
productive purpose
Mm.
can I take this terrible tragedy in my life, whatever it is that a person's going through on the individual level, or
Mhm,
let's say on a national ethnic level,
mhm,
like your people went through or my people went through,
mhm,
to ask what can we learn from this? How can we somehow do something positive with this? Not why,
Mm-hmm.
but what.
What? Yeah.
And I really think you've done that. You've devoted your life. You went to law school and became an international law activist on behalf of human rights, preventing genocide, and really educating the world. And you've done an incredible lot with this terrible tragedy in your life. And there's nothing holier and nothing more beautiful than being able to not only survive trauma in a person's life. And what I'm saying doesn't only apply on the national level, it applies to anyone listening to this going through a difficult traumatic experience in their own personal lives.
Yeah.
To be able to say, I survived, A, and B, at some later point, like David Gewurtzman inspired you to do,
Mm-hmm.
your mentor.
Mm-hmm.
He should rest in peace. And I'm sure you're bringing such, what we say in Hebrew, nachas, and joy to his soul.
Mm-hmm.
But what he inspired you and what you're doing
Mm-hmm.
is to take that terrible tragedy and losing your entire family and bringing honor to their memory by doing something positive with it, by educating people and inspiring people to know what we as human beings need to do for each other to prevent genocide. And I hope that your voice continues to be heard. And I hope what you said about the Ukraine also gets heard in the highest offices in this country and throughout the world, that we cannot stand by
Mm-hmm.
as aggressors just take advantage of their power
Mm-hmm.
and do terrible things to other people.
Yeah.
I thank you so much for coming on and for giving us of your time. I know how busy you are, and I really do appreciate, and I hope we at MGE will have the opportunity to hear more from you. I'd love, now that I know you live in Brooklyn, we can get you to Manhattan sometimes. It would be such an honor to be able to host you in person at an MGE event. We're going to be doing a Yom HaShoah event in a couple of weeks, interviewing a survivor from the Holocaust. I would love to be able to. You're really such an impressive person on so many levels, and I thank you for your incredible work on behalf of humanity.
Thank you so much for having me. And I really do believe that all we are called to do is our part. You know, it's very easy to get overwhelmed with all the atrocities that are being committed. But I think if all of us can commit to doing our part, then our world will be certainly be a better place for ourselves and for future generations. So thank you for all you do, and certainly I'll continue to do, my part as much and as best as I can.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, and God bless you. And
Thank
God
you.
bless your incredible work.
Thank you very much. Same to you.